Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be responding to a question from a listener of the podcast. But before we get into that, I want to make just a quick announcement that we are going to be doing an upcoming case study, sort of a real breakdown of an actual student and the strengths, the weaknesses of their profile. Many of you know, we've had some of these in the past. These are among our most popular episodes. We've done them mostly in the context of the application process and done full length application reviews and breaking down students' candidacies. But this time around, we're going to mainly be targeting students who are in younger grades, not to the application process yet. This could be juniors, it could be 10th graders, etc. And so if you are interested in having me break down your candidacy and ruthlessly and relentlessly pointing out all of your deficiencies so that hopefully you can fix them to become the best candidate possible. You can reach out to us, shoot us an email, info@greatmindsadvising.com, info@greatmindsadvising.com. And we'll put a little link in the show notes as well if you want to volunteer yourself for an upcoming case study. In your email, just put some basic background information just to sort of introduce yourself, high school the student attends, grades, GPA, sort of course rigor, test scores if applicable, maybe a little bit about the student's resume, and potentially any sort of college goals or questions. Just give us sort of a high level summary, and then we will follow up from there with much more detailed sort of materials and background requests so we can really dive deep into the student's candidacy. So, again, if you're interested in that, just shoot us an email info@greatmindsadvising.com. Okay, let's get into the main episode here. So, this listener wrote us an email and they said, Sam and team, my oldest is currently in his junior year of high school, and your podcast has been incredibly informative and helpful. However, you spend a lot of time discussing strategies for early decision applications. I understand why this is the case, but those conversations just don't really apply to us since we aren't interested in making the sort of financial commitment that the ED round might impose. We understand the opportunity we are foregoing, but that's just the way it is, and I imagine the same is true for many other families, whether by necessity or by choice. Also, some schools have made it clear that almost all their merit scholarship opportunities are awarded solely in the early action round. So we don't want to miss out on those opportunities by going ED. That all being the case, I was hoping you might consider devoting an episode to strategies for students who are specifically going early action, but not early decision. For instance, Tulane is well known for caring about demonstrated interest and being very protective of their yields. As you've made clear, going ED is the best way to show demonstrated interest. So, since Tulane has ED, but we're not going ED, should we somehow make it clear to Tulane that we aren't going ED to any colleges so as to avoid being yielded? On a separate note, schools such as Tulane and Notre Dame are specifically known for placing emphasis on service. I understand your stance on mission trips seeming performative, but for colleges such as these, would you adjust your strategy on that at all? Also, would you consider the Notre Dame Summer Leadership Seminar an application-worthy summer program such as Yale Young Global Scholars? Thanks again. Okay, so let's break down the sort of early action question here with respect to demonstrated interest. So, this isn't just applicable to this particular listener and family here. Even if you are planning on doing early decision, let's say to two colleges, you're going to do ED1 and ED2, but you're applying to 14 different colleges, you're not going to be applying ED at 12 out of the 14 colleges. This is still widely applicable to everyone in a lot of ways, because you only have a certain number of sort of ED bullets, so to speak, in the chamber. You can only put in a binding commitment to a very limited and finite number of schools. So the first thing that I wanted to sort of make unambiguous is, if the question is how do we sort of simulate the same degree of demonstrated interest, but not putting in a binding commitment or going ED, and applying EA, for example, instead? The answer is you can't, right? ED is principally a very valuable signal because it's a costly signal. It is telling the institution that basically you're willing to incur a pretty significant cost that might be a financial cost. You're sort of just saying, hey, we're not going to look at any other scholarship opportunities. We're making a financial commitment here. And as I've mentioned in past episodes, the school does have to sort of match whatever need is sort of proven by the family, and you can sort of dive into that, the net price calculator, et cetera, so you sort of have a sense of that before, and if they can't meet, sort of that need, then, that is a reason to actually back out of the early decision. So there is that, but you can't sort of play the field in terms of looking at, what, a whole bunch of other schools might give you in terms of scholarships, if that's even going to be the case. And so there is a cost. There's a costly signal, which makes it a valuable signal. You also are just foregoing other alternatives. And so the things that people don't like about early decision are precisely the things that make early decision valuable. Anytime there is difficulty, particularly right now in the age of artificial intelligence, now, if you're sending reach out emails or something, now people are just putting together AI generated notes. And so now things like a handwritten letter, for example, right? It's much more difficult and manual. But that is a costly signal, right? And so I've mentioned this before in the podcast, particularly when it comes to students' resume building or just building a candidacy or just talking about difficulty in general. Do you want to be the student who has something go wrong in your research project and you're in the lab until 10 p.m. on a summer night? As I've mentioned, we've had students where that is the case. No, you don't want that to be the case. But it also makes for an exceptional narrative when a college finds out that that is what happened and the student went through that bit of adversity and sort of persevered. And they're the type of student who can endure setbacks and challenges, right? And so there's another side of difficulty. It's a signal and it's a valuable signal, right? And so you cannot mimic this signal without forgoing those potential opportunities. If it is not a costly signal, it is not as valuable of a signal, right? And so we just have to understand that these concepts are inextricably linked. The difficulty or the same reasons that a lot of people don't like early decision are precisely what makes it valuable strategically. It is telling the college you are incurring a significant cost, you're taking all your other alternatives off the table. There are, just implications in terms of you can't go to those other schools, but there's also potentially financial implications. And of course, there are people, where they potentially, don't wanna do that. They don't want they wanna sort of see other options, or they just want to see all the financial options and be able to weigh them, and that's what makes ED, a lot of people don't like it, but again, that's also precisely what makes it valuable. So there is no other form of demonstrated interest or combination of forms of demonstrated interest that can ever really take the place of early decision, which is why I mentioned a few episodes ago that it basically blows every other piece of demonstrated interest out of the water. And there's just 100-mile gap between a student who does early decision from a demonstrated interest perspective and then all the other demonstrated interest items. So you have to understand that. That being said, if you're not going to do early decision, then you just have to take advantage of any of the other demonstrated interest items. What sort of is the second most important demonstrated interest item? Well, that would be your school essays, right? Your school specific supplements, provided the school gives you school specific essays. So that is, why do you want to come to our institution? Why do you want to study this field? And making sure that those are, very calibrated to the institution, very calibrated to your hook and your narrative, and sort of showing the intersection, how you sort of bring your unique hook, your unique narrative, your unique skill set to the college, and how you'll take advantage, uniquely of that school's resources in those essays. That shows the school that you really love that school, and you might have a higher probability of enrolling versus a student who sort of mails those essays in or just doesn't make them as excellent as they otherwise could be, right? So I would sort of say that's like your number 2 in terms of demonstrated interest. Then you have a whole bunch of other sort of more what I would refer to as checkbox items. So doing things like campus visits, information sessions, if the admissions officers, come to your school or do a Zoom, usually that's going to be high school, fall of senior year, but sometimes juniors are also allowed to attend those information sessions at high school that the college, is giving. So you could do info sessions, you could do virtual info sessions or virtual webinars. Sometimes there's local events or fairs. You sort of have like very minor items like just opening their emails and click-through rates and watching videos. Those are sort of your more minutia demonstrated interest items that are usually what most people conventionally refer to as demonstrated interest. And when a school sort of says, Do we track demonstrated interest? Do we not track demonstrated interest? Those are usually the items. They're not usually talking specifically about early decision or even in a lot of cases the school essays. They're talking a lot more about things like campus visits, info sessions, email open rates, etc. So I would say that if you're not doing early decision, but you still want to maximally demonstrate your interest, you're never going to compete with somebody who's just doing early decision. It's just not even in question. But your best alternative, again, is going to be through the school essays, and then through other sort of more ancillary items, as I mentioned, campus visits, information sessions, etc. All that being said, you can do all of those items and still fail to get in. So you just have to understand that in not incurring the cost of early decision, it's not that you're not incurring a cost at all, you're just incurring a different cost to your candidacy. Another thing I want to just quickly mention here is that a lot of people when, and it sort of again depends what sort of boat you're in. If you just can't, if you don't consider it financially feasible, you have to sort of see all of your other, financial options and just see if you're going to get a scholarship. That certainly nobody can, there's nothing to really say there. That's just a personal financial situation and specific to a family. But one thing to sort of be very careful about is a lot of people are making decisions based on imagined reality that may never actually come to fruition, right? And so what I mean by that is we do know for sure that if you want to maximize your odds of getting into a top college, if that is the goal, now that may not actually be the goal, right? It could be that for certain students, they sort of have this scale of sort of financial considerations versus the quality of the institution. And if they got into a top 15 school, there was a number 75 school that gave them a full scholarship. They would go to the number 75 school with a full scholarship. And again, that's very idiosyncratic to the particular family and financial situation, et cetera, right? And there is no common objective way of converting, dollars to quality of institution, or education. One thing you sort of have to understand is that, in terms of ED strategically getting into a top college, it is going to give you a major lever in most cases. And so we know that not doing early decision is for sure guaranteed to incur a strategic cost to your candidacy, right? That is a known, right? Because we know that there are much higher multiples in terms of ED students getting admitted. And so by not doing ED, you are foregoing a major strategic advantage and source of leverage, right? That is guaranteed, right? Compared to the other students at any given institution who are doing early decision, they've just signaled something that is, of value to the college and they have a significant advantage over you as an applicant. We know for sure that there is a guaranteed cost to your candidacy, at least from a getting in perspective, right? However, there is no guarantee with respect to what the upside is of not doing early decision, right? And so if we're sort of imagining this situation here, whereby, we don't do early decision because we want to sort of see what the scholarship opportunities are or where we get into the other schools, that is not actually guaranteed, right? There is no guarantee in terms of you getting into any other schools, let alone schools that you maybe want to go to or getting scholarships, right? And so for the sort of hypothetical of not doing early decision, because you wanna sort of hold the optionality for getting scholarships. Well, we only know one thing here, which is we know that there is a cost of, strategically not doing early decision, but we don't actually know that you're going to get any scholarships, right, from the other schools. And so, it's just sort of understanding because one thing that I know this is really interesting, this process in terms of just human psychology and decision making. And one thing that we've seen over the years is when people make decisions, you have to sort of actually dive into their imagination. They're imagining some certain future. And, for example, they're sort of deciding between doing, a single choice early action to Stanford or applying early decision to Duke, right? But you sort of have to really dive into what is that sort of mental picture they have in their head of the future. You sort of have to really, like, tackle it and sort of break it down and say, like, how rational and sort of logical is this? Do they actually really understand the probabilities? They might be over-indexing, on sort of a situation where they're like, what they're imagining in that situation is, they get in early decision to Duke, and then they're sort of like, devastated because they never, sort of know what happened with Stanford, right? Whereas somebody who's an expert has dealt with hundreds of cases of students. They know what a Stanford kid looks like who gets in. They know what a Duke kid looks like who gets in. Can just say very simply, you're not getting into Stanford. And so that situation you're imagining in your head is not like it's not even a valid situation. That's something I just wanted to comment is because what people are imagining in terms of the future when they make decisions a lot of times is just wrong. It is an imagined world that actually is has an extremely low probability of actually materializing. So you do just have to understand that sort of situation as well. That's the first part of the question. They also asked in terms of doing early decision. There's sort of two potential cases here, right? One is you're not doing early decision to a given institution, but you are doing it to other institutions. And for the first institution, that would be particularly bad because if the other ED institutions take you, then you're definitely sort of, off the board. But then there's a second sort of scenario here that's not as bad to the first institution, which is you're not doing ED to their institution, but you're also not doing ED at all. That would be a little bit, more sort of, they'd be a little bit more amenable there. That's not sort of as bad of a situation as a student where they're not doing ED to this institution, but they are doing ED to other institutions, right? And so they're sort of asking this question, should they tell the colleges, somewhere in the application or whatnot, that, hey, we're not doing early decision to your institution, but we're not doing ED to any institution. So the direct answer to that is no. Most colleges don't believe what you say because a lot of students lie and a lot of families make things up. That would not be the right way to go about it. And it'd be very weird. Second, if you do want somebody to actually potentially mention it, this is where counselors come into play. And these are sort of more objective, neutral, sources. This is why recommendations figure fairly prominently if they're written very well, because, a student can say something about themselves, but we tend not to trust what people say about themselves as much as we trust what other people say about those individuals, right? So a counselor could potentially put this somewhere or mention to the college, but you have to understand it still doesn't matter and it's still not replacing early decision, right? And so it's sort of trying to want to get around, not doing early decision and try to get it, which obviously I understand, but there just is no substitute for doing early decision. So the problem, still remains. Sure, okay, even if you could get your counselor in this hypothetical to say, hey, Bobby's not doing, ED to any institutions. But the thing is, you're still probably applying like 18 different colleges, and this is just one out of the 18. And so, yeah, you might not be doing early decision at the other colleges, but you still have 17 other colleges on your list, right? Like, what's the probability you're coming to our institution, right, out of 18? Is it a little bit better, in that situation where you're just applying to a bunch of colleges, but you're not doing ED to any of them versus if you were doing ED to alternative institutions? Yeah, it's a little bit better, but it still isn't very meaningful to a college, right? It's like you're just casting a wide net and you don't have any, particular, extreme loyalty to any institution. You're playing the field, and when you play the field, you get the benefits of playing the field, which you sort of get to see all of your decisions, and go through all of the process. You also signal to any given college that you are playing the field and you have to be willing to incur, the consequences of those actions as well. So that was the second horn of the first question. Let's get into their second-ish kind of question here. A lot of people, when they send questions and it's like an eight-pronged question. On a separate note, schools such as Tulane and Notre Dame are specifically known for placing emphasis on service. I understand your stance on mission trips seeming performative, but for colleges such as these, would you adjust your strategy on that at all? Also, would you consider the Notre Dame Summer Leadership Seminar an application with the summer programs such as Yale Young Global Scholars? So the Notre Dame programs, they have 2 summer, programs. They're not upper echelon like Yale Young Global Scholars, MIT RSI, a whole bunch of other ones, M&T SI. They're not on the same playing field. They're not in that upper echelon of, summer programs. So the quick answer to that is no. And also, since we are talking a lot about financials here, if you do wanna save yourself a lot of money, one great way of doing it, besides, not doing ED and then hoping you get scholarships, which is unknown, is not enrolling in expensive summer programs that don't move the needle for your candidacy, and also not having to do campus visits for schools and, schedule all the travel and the hotels and the accommodations because, you have to do campus visits because you have to sort of, you're sort of behind in terms of showing demonstrated interest. Something to also take into account here. I'm not saying that it would, the financial amount would, be the same as $100,000 scholarship. But again, we also don't know that anybody's receiving $100,000 scholarship either. In terms of this notion of service, this is something that is vastly overblown in terms of admissions. Yes, there are different schools. Yes, they do have some differing institutional priorities. Yes, they do rate applicants in some cases in a slightly different way. Um, but fundamentally, all these colleges are looking for very similar things. And so the notion that service is more specific to Tulane or Notre Dame is, pretty crazy. It's not that service is, peculiar to these institutions, right? And so you're optimizing your candidacy, regardless of the school specifically, you are still optimizing your general candidacy building for all of the schools, and they are still all are fundamentally looking for very similar things, right? And so you could sort of say, well, Stanford, will take a student, who's maybe not the absolute best on paper, but is much more compelling, and, sort of more unique and more idiosyncratic versus Harvard. Yeah, that's true, but what Stanford's doing there in terms of optimizing for uniqueness and, very niche candidates, that still works well for all institutions, right? And if you're talking about Stanford versus Harvard, it's like, well, if you were the best candidate on paper and you also were extremely unique, then you would just not have that problem at all, right? And a lot of people, again, they're very conditioned to think in terms of this or mindset, right? And so you're trying to do all of these things. You're trying to be the most impressive on paper and you're trying to be really unique and niche. There should be some concept of service in terms of your candidacy, right? Ideally. In terms of service, I think what's happening here is service is being too closely defined as things like mission trips and Habitat for Humanity and soup kitchens. And I would say service is just anything where you are leveraging your skill set, your passions, more ideally not just generic service, or not just doing it generically, but ideally, you're taking whatever your hook is, whatever your main narrative is, whatever your main passions are, whatever your main strengths are, and you're specifically using those as vehicles for giving back. I mentioned a few episodes ago in the perfect activity for Ivy Plus colleges, a student who had an absolutely excellent activity and so she was afflicted with food allergies. And so she started an organization that was involved with baking and sort of baking allergen free foods. Right. Is that not a form of service because she's not sort of putting, hammering nails into woods in Appalachia? Of course, it's a form of service. Right. And so I think a lot of what's being implied here is that service is working in Guatemala or something or Africa. And yes, those are very common forms of service and they are more likely to look potentially performative. At the very least, they just don't look unique. Understand that in the example that I just gave the student who was affected with the food, the food allergies, it seems a lot more genuine and not likely to be fake or to sort of be what, I've referred to as conspicuous compassion or virtue signaling, the sort of performative aspects here that this listener is, sort of mentioning because she actually was affected by this, right? And so it doesn't seem like it would be fake. It's sort of handicapped by virtue of her emotional or personal connection. And I would say that is much more ideal in terms of the service that a student has in their candidacy, ideally not making it just generic service that could be perceived as performative or just not unique. And this will be true, particularly, in a Notre Dame applicant pool, where you're going to have a lot of kids who go to Catholic high schools, and there's going to have a lot of very common, types of service, right? And the applicant who can basically say, hey, I have this very particular skill set that is basically my hook, right? This is the narrative. This is, sort of what you're presenting and sort of say, I'm amazing at coding. And so I decided to launch, this coding program with local libraries. It just seems more genuine because it's handicapped, it's connected to the student's skill set. And so really what you want to do is for service to actually not be this sort of like, checkbox item, but you really want it to be anchored in some sort of emotional connection. Like even if you did service, but, the family is from Peru or the students from Peru, for example. At least if they did service in Peru, it would probably seem a little bit more genuine, right? Because they have an actual emotional or personal connection to that place, right? Versus doing it in Africa, for example. I would say if it's anchored in something personal or emotionally significant to the student, or it's anchored in their skill set, in their sort of hook, in terms of how, they're positioning themselves and what their sort of passion is, it's going to come across as a lot more genuine, less likely to be received as performative, but also a lot more unique as well. I wouldn't sort of equate service with just mission trips and Habitat for Humanity and soup kitchens. You can think of service in a much broader way. And again, I would try to make it a lot more calibrated. There's so many cliches in emissions that just abound, like, leadership, right? It's not just leadership or service, it's calibrated leadership or service, right? They don't care that you're the captain of the varsity football team, right? Assuming that you're not a recruited athlete, as much as they would care for a student who founded and runs a club, that's the cognitive science club, and that's their actual hook and their angle for admissions, right? One student has relevant leadership and the other student doesn't, right? If their narrative were cognitive science, but they were captain of the football team, is it leadership and is it better than not being a leader? For sure, right? But is as good as a student who has relevant leadership where their narrative or their hook is cognitive science and they founded and led the cognitive science club and they have a bunch of contributions, it's not going to be as impressive. And so it's important that it's calibrated service or calibrated leadership, right? That is actually relevant to the through line and the actual hook, right? Is what's going to make it a lot more valuable and will draw less skepticism, right? And so I would sort of say, for one, this notion that, institutions have, vastly different, oh, there's these institutions and they really care about service. Same thing with demonstrated interest. Pretty much every single college cares about demonstrated interest outside of Harvard and Stanford, which pretty much don't have any yield problems, right? Outside of Harvard and Stanford, pretty much every single college in the United States cares about demonstrated interests and how many students are going to be accepting their offer of admission, right? So this notion that, oh, these schools, care about demonstrated interest, there are a whole bunch of schools and they just lie. And there's different forms of demonstrated interest when they sort of say, oh, we don't consider demonstrated interest. It's like, yeah, but you have school specific essays that clearly would demonstrate interest, right? You think they don't care what the quality of those essays are? You think you don't care whether you ED or not? Right? So if you consider that demonstrated interest, of course they care, right? Emory will tell you they don't care about demonstrated interest. They have 2 rounds of early decision. They couldn't tell you in any more of a clear way that they care about demonstrated interest. They literally invented demonstrated interest. So I wouldn't buy a lot of what colleges say or sort of looking in the common data set and you're sort of looking at the, oh, they strongly consider this. A lot of these colleges fundamentally are looking for and care about the same things, right? So service is not specific to any, institutions per se. It is just it's something that is obviously very good to have in your candidacy, and it should ideally flow through your skills, your talents, your abilities, your passions, your emotional connections, maybe your personal background, etc. Is sort of how to anchor it in a much more effective and way that sort of would be a lot more likely to be perceived as genuine as well. I would get rid of the notion of these institutions vastly differ in terms of, they're looking for this or looking for that or service or not. Just understand that that is a certainly still a potent form of student's candidacy that has not changed in decades, but it is much more about the calibration of the service or the leadership versus just these very cliche maxims of be a leader or sort of do service. Hopefully that was helpful here to both this listener and to everyone tuning in. And we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye bye.